People who hate others for who they are have become increasingly bold in expressing their views in public. Their hatred is misplaced, and their understanding of things like being transgender is generally wrong. But what exactly is the hate, and why is it so incorrect? There are some people who dislike trans people and don't view them as exactly human, but more as deviants from the binary that the American culture has built for ourselves. They hate trans people because they challenge the norm, and that scares them. This hate that trans people face is the preservation of cis heteronormative ideals, and it disregards the fact that gender is not a binary. But before I talk about that, let me give you a brief explanation of what being trans actually is. Merriam-Webster states that being trans or transgender is being a person whose gender identity differs from the sex the person was given at birth. Basically, what this means is that if you're a trans person whose assigned gender at birth was male, you might experience a disconnect from your assigned male gender to your actual gender identity. This can come in many forms, and there are no rules to being trans. Many trans people experience gender dysphoria, which is described as a state of severe distress or unhappiness caused by the feeling that one's gender identity does not match one's sex registered at birth. This means that someone with gender dysphoria experiences severe discomfort from being in the wrong body. If you aren't trans, imagine that one day you woke up as the opposite sex. If you're cis, you wouldn't like it, would you? All of this is to say that being trans is a normal thing and not anything bad. It's just being human. There are infinite ways to be trans, just as there are infinite ways to be cis. Gender can't be a binary or a spectrum, because that implies that there are ends to gender. It is ever-changing because there are infinite ways to be human. A common misconception is that gender is the same as your sex assigned at birth. These are two very different things because someone's body does not equal their gender identity automatically. Gender is broken up into 5 parts. Your gender identity, the identity that aligns with how you feel, gender expression, how you express yourself to the world, sex assigned at birth, typically male, female, or intersex features, and who you're attracted to, physically and emotionally. These are important distinctions to be aware of because these are separate things. These are all very different things that make someone who they are. Transphobes tend to follow the same few talking points, which usually include detransitioners, that they are a threat to children, and generally that trans people are just threatening. Detransitioners are a big talking point for conservatives. Detransitioners are people who identified as trans but later feel that they align with their gender assigned at birth. These people are entirely valid and should not be excluded or harassed because of their identity. Transphobes tend to use these people's stories as proof that trans people aren't valid. Not only is this horribly insensitive towards detransitioners' identities, but it is also something that should not even come into play in this conversation. Gender GP states that, according to 2022 statistics, only around 3% of trans people experience some form of regret, but may not detransition. They then go on to say only 5% of people who detransition, that's 5% of the 3%, who experience some form of regret, so 0.4% of all trans people did so because they felt that the transition was not right for them. This insanely small percentage of people who regret transitioning should not come into play when discussing trans people. Not all detransitioners do it because they aren't trans, though. In fact, many detransitioners detransition because of social pressure. People being unsupportive is one of the main reasons that people detransition. This small percentage of people are entirely valid, but should not be used as a tool to take down other trans people. An argument that transphobes also use, along with detransitioners, is that trans people are mutilating their bodies with gender-affirming care. Gender-affirming care comes in many different forms, but for children, doctors start with puberty blockers. These puberty blockers just suppress the trans person's puberty for an extended period of time. The effects of this are entirely reversible. This just gives them time to figure out their identity. The process to get this care takes a long time, and doctors aren't just handing out puberty blockers left and right. After this, if the doctors and the patient feel it necessary, the trans person will start some form of hormones. This also takes extensive and thorough examination of the patient to make sure that it's the right choice. It can take over a year just to get the okay. Again, not all trans people feel it necessary to medically transition. This is only for people who are sure that this is what they want. This treatment can be followed up by surgery, but that comes with adulthood, so no child is getting surgery. This medical transition is done because trans people want to feel comfortable in their own body. Mayo Clinic states that treatment for gender dysphoria can include changes in gender expression, hormone therapy, surgery, and supportive behavioral health therapy. Gender dysphoria can't just go away with traditional therapy, though it can help. Medically transitioning can be necessary depending on the person. Suicide rates are much higher among trans people when they can't get medical intervention because they are literally in the wrong body. Trans people aren't mutilating their bodies. This treatment is necessary for the health and well-being of the trans person. I find it interesting that transphobic people aren't talking about cis teens getting plastic surgery. Most of the time, plastic surgery isn't necessary, and there is a much higher regret rate. Transphobic people only go after medically necessary interventions because they want an excuse to be transphobic. The idea that trans people are predatory is derived from the idea that trans people are deviants. Instead of thinking of trans people as humans who are just trying to live their lives, these transphobes frame trans people as a threat because they don't align with the norm. It is also an insane generalization of a group. If one trans person did something bad, the entire community would become under attack. On the other hand, if 20 cis people did something bad, nobody would say that they did it because they were cis. There is no correlation between being a bad person and being trans or being a part of any other minority. This argument of predatory tendencies is just an easy way to spread hate because transphobic people aren't saying this because they believe it. They're saying it because fear is the easiest tactic to attack people. If you make a group of people seem like a threat, the majority will take the bait. So transphobic people say this not for the facts, but for the power and fear-mongering. In the late 1960s, the gay rights movement started to gain steam, and with the riot at Stonewall, the LGBTQ community began to push for justice. At the same time, anti-gay rhetoric started spreading. Ideas that gay people were unnatural and dangerous began to be more common. Children grew up believing that being gay was a horrible, demonic thing. At this time, HIV and AIDS were spreading across America and largely affecting gay people. The government purposefully ignored the disease because it was rampant in gay communities, and therefore, in the minds of the leaders of the U.S., HIV and AIDS was the fault of gay people, even though straight people got it too. The government only intervened when it started affecting straight people more. This hate and discrimination was built on bias and fear of people being different. We now look back on this and see how idiotic it is, but we are living this out again, just targeting a different minority. Many ideas that homophobic people held and still hold are being perpetuated now, but just towards trans people. The number of openly trans people has gone up by a lot because there is much more acceptance and knowledge about the topic. This is also what happened in the late 1960s because there was more acceptance of gay people. Transphobic people argue that trans people are indoctrinating children, and that's why there is a spike in people coming out as trans. But really, we're seeing the exact same thing that happened with gay rights. There was a spike in gay people, but it evened out as people began to understand it more. These parallels between the gay rights movement and the trans rights movement are important to keep in mind because we will most likely see wider acceptance in a few years because there will be more awareness, just like in the gay rights movement of the 1960s. There are a lot of things fighting against our right to be human. There are people out there who hate trans people just for being themselves, and there's no amount of truth that can convince them that they are wrong. Deep down, these people are just afraid of change. They are too weak to understand that not everything fits within the cramped boxes that they put themselves in. But despite these people, trans people still thrive. Being trans can be one of the most beautiful things, even with all the hate. In all of this, one thing stays true.
Hey, my name is Ace. This is my voice. I have a voice. Test of
We can't be erased.